They say weddings are for beginnings, not endings. But as I stood at the back of the grand hall in Schloss Marienhohe watching my husband Marcus raise his champagne glass, I realized that some people choose the worst moments for their most dramatic exits. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice clear and commanding as always, "before we toast the newlyweds, I'd like to share a bit of news with you all." There was laughter, murmurs of curiosity. I was standing by the floral archway, beside a table filled with petit fours and imported champagne, watching my son Julian dance with his new wife. The music had just faded as Marcus stepped up to the microphone. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "As of next Monday, our company's longtime CFO, Linda Bergstrom, my incredible wife of 30 years, will be taking an early retirement. She's earned it. She's worked so hard behind the scenes and now it's time she enjoyed life a little." Silence. Then a confused ripple of claps, a few gasps. Julian stopped dancing mid-step. His bride looked from him to me in alarm. My heart didn't skip a beat. It froze. Not from surprise, because I already knew what he would say, but from the sheer audacity of the timing. On our son's wedding day, in front of family, colleagues, clients, investors, Marcus didn't just want to fire me, he wanted to humiliate me. I smiled. Not the kind of smile that hides pain. A calm, knowing smile, the kind that says, "You have no idea what's coming." I stepped forward and slowly approached the head table where Marcus stood. Guests parted for me like the Red Sea. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small, unmarked USB drive in a clear case. He blinked. "What's that?" "Something for you to plug in Monday morning," I said, my voice level. "Consider it a transition tool." There was a long pause. I looked him in the eye and placed the USB beside the dessert menu on his plate. Then I turned to the guests. "Let's not let this small distraction take away from the reason we're here today. Julian, Lena, your love deserves the full attention of everyone here, so please, let's raise our glasses." People murmured awkwardly. Some raised glasses. Others glanced at Marcus, who looked like someone had just slapped him in the face with a glove made of ice. I walked away before anyone could follow. Outside, the sun was dipping behind the hills of Lower Saxony. The late spring air was crisp. Somewhere in the trees beyond the garden, a bird let out a long, mournful call. I stood near a stone bench, letting the cool air touch my skin, listening to the faint echo of laughter and confusion from inside. I felt free, for the first time in years. I heard the hall doors bang open behind me, and footsteps, fast, agitated. "Linda!" Marcus hissed. "What the hell was that?" I didn't turn around. "A professional courtesy. You like surprise announcements. I thought I'd give you one in return." "You can't just—" He stumbled over his words, lowering his voice as a few distant guests stepped outside to smoke. "You can't just retaliate like this." "Retaliate?" I laughed softly. "This isn't revenge, Marcus. This is logistics, something you always underestimated me for. You're being dramatic. This was just a symbolic gesture. I thought we agreed—" "No, Marcus, you decided, like you always do. Like you did when you secretly reorganized our company's voting shares last quarter. Like you did when you negotiated with Kronenthal Ventures behind my back. You were planning this exit for months." His face twisted. "I didn't want to involve you because I knew you'd resist. You're too traditional, risk-averse. And you're too arrogant to believe I saw it all coming," I whispered. "You always think you're the only one in the room with a plan." He glanced toward the USB on the table through the open door. "What's on that thing?" I looked at him for the first time since stepping outside. "You'll see, Monday, or sooner if you panic enough." I turned and walked toward the gravel path that led to the guest house. My heels crunched softly. My shoulders relaxed. Behind me I heard him call after me. "Linda, please, don't do something we can't take back." I didn't respond. Because what he didn't understand was this: I already had. I wasn't always in the background. There was a time decades ago when Marcus and I were equals. We were two ambitious students fresh out of the University of Göttingen. He studied systems engineering, I studied finance and economics. We were idealistic, tireless, and completely broke. We built our life from nothing, shared a basement apartment that smelled of mildew and cheap curry, burned midnight oil drafting pitch decks for investors who never called back, celebrated small victories with instant ramen and warm beer. When Marcus had the idea to launch a startup focused on AI-powered logistics software, I was the one who wrote the first business plan. I was the one who cold-called vendors and calculated costs while he coded in our shared living room. I was the one who handled the finances, the payroll, the tax strategy, and the risk analysis, but he was the face, the voice, the storyteller. And in Germany, especially in the late 90s, charisma carried further than competence. "I'll be the vision," he told me once over coffee and a mountain of receipts. "You be the engine." I smiled at the time. I was proud to be the engine. Engines matter, even if no one claps for them when the car arrives. When Julian was born, I stepped back a bit. Not completely. I still ran our financials from home, still consulted during critical board meetings, still balanced contracts while burping a baby with one hand and typing with the other. Marcus became CEO. I became his wife, who also works in finance. It didn't bother me, at least not then. Our goals were shared. Our name was on everything. Bergstrom Software was our legacy. I believed that wholeheartedly. But things changed. Success changed Marcus. He began to believe his own press. The young CEO prodigy, the AI visionary, the one who built everything from the ground up. I watched as journalists quoted him like gospel, never once asking who wrote the projections they were praising. I watched as he introduced me at gala events as the brains behind the books, a phrase that felt more patronizing every time. Still, I stayed. For Julian, who deserved a stable home, for the employees who had become like family, for the version of Marcus I had once loved, the one who still sent me flowers on our anniversary, who cried when Julian said mama first, who made pancakes on Sunday mornings with far too much Nutella. But over the last 5 years, something shifted for good. He stopped asking my opinion before major decisions. He grew colder at home, his phone always buzzing, always turned away from me. He began attending tech retreats in Ibiza and Lisbon alone, often with a bottle of cologne I didn't buy and shirts I didn't recognize. He hired a new executive assistant named Lydia, who looked young enough to be Julian's classmate, and worst of all, he stopped talking to me like a partner. One evening I asked him gently, "Have you thought about what the next phase for us looks like?" He didn't look up from his iPad. "I have. And I think you should slow down, Linda. Maybe think about stepping back entirely." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a roadmap he had drawn without me. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of herbal tea and a legal pad. I wrote down everything I'd contributed to the company in the last 3 years. Every deal I'd brokered, every risk I'd identified, every investor I'd managed during crisis moments. The list was longer than I expected. It hit me then. I had built the company too. Quietly, carefully, thoroughly. And yet, in the eyes of the world and my own husband, I was expendable. But being overlooked had given me an advantage. No one suspected what I was capable of. When I took over our tax advisory meetings, no one asked why. When I reorganized the internal accounting software to create a clearer audit trail, no one paid attention. When I transferred small holdings into a trust under the name of an anonymous entity, even our lawyers barely blinked. Marcus once said I was risk-averse. He was wrong. I was patient, and I was done waiting for someone to give me a seat at the table. This time, I would build the table myself. It started with a shareholder email, not addressed to me, of course, just one of those automated reports forwarded to the general executive loop. Marcus rarely checked the loop anymore, delegated everything, barely skimmed internal updates unless they had his name in bold. But I did, I always did. The email was from our internal compliance team, noting that 3 Class B shareholders, people I'd known for years, had sold their voting shares to a new holding company called Lindenthal GmbH. Lindenthal? It wasn't a name I recognized, which in and of itself meant nothing. It could have been a harmless reorganization. Startups shuffle assets all the time, but something about it didn't sit right. I went into our secure investor dashboard. Most executives only accessed it once a quarter. I checked it weekly. There it was. Lindenthal GmbH had quietly amassed 9.2% of voting shares over the past 2 months. Just below the 10% threshold that would have triggered public disclosure. Curious, I dug deeper. Its listed address, a shared office space in Frankfurt, its managing officer, a man named Benedict Rauch, someone who hadn't previously appeared in any of our investor records. I searched his name. Almost nothing. No LinkedIn, no prior business activity, like he didn't exist, except for 2 advisory roles at shell companies that had briefly interacted with Bergstrom Software 5 years ago during a round of angel investments. That was the thread I needed. The next day, I booked a train to Frankfurt, under the pretense of meeting a potential client. I didn't tell Marcus. When I arrived at the address, it was exactly what I expected. A hallway of polished glass doors, virtual reception, smiling staff who didn't know any of the tenants personally. I asked for Lindenthal. The woman at the desk checked her system and smiled. "They don't take in-person meetings. Everything's handled through counsel." I thanked her and left. Outside, leaning against a lamppost, I called a private investigator I'd worked with once before, back when we were doing due diligence on a merger. "Hi, Lucas," I said. "I need a background check on a company, quietly." "I'll double your rate." He didn't ask questions. He never did. That evening I returned to Hamburg and walked into our kitchen to find Marcus uncorking a bottle of Italian red, humming to himself. "How was Frankfurt?" he asked, pouring 2 glasses like nothing was unusual. I stared at him for a beat, then smiled. "Productive?" He handed me a glass. "You work too hard." I clinked it gently. "That's what you always loved about me." He laughed. "That, and your risk analysis spreadsheets." I drank slowly, watching his eyes. That weekend, Lucas called. Lindenthal GmbH is a proxy firm, a cover. The real backers are Kronenthal Ventures. You've heard of them? My blood turned cold. I had heard of them. A private equity firm with a reputation for quiet takeovers and restructuring. They had a history of buying into family-run companies, removing legacy leadership, and flipping the business for short-term gains. Marcus had mentioned Kronenthal a few months ago, said they'd expressed interest in a possible expansion partnership. He told me he'd turned them down flat. "They're not our kind of people," he'd said. Apparently that was a lie. Now it made sense. The reshuffling of board seats, the sudden exit packages approved for our most loyal executives, the subtle changes in how employee bonuses were distributed. Marcus wasn't planning to retire me. He was planning to cut me out, entirely. There would be no graceful exit, no consulting role, no public gratitude, just a staged announcement, a forced transition, and then a clean slate for him to present to Kronenthal. "Here's your lean new executive team. No strings, no emotional baggage, just me." But Marcus had made one miscalculation. He thought I was the baggage. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen that night, opening a new spreadsheet. I titled it, Phase 1, Reverse Leverage. Then I began listing the names of every employee, board member and shareholder who still believed in me more than they did in Marcus. There were more than I expected. It wouldn't be easy. But I had time. And I had the most powerful weapon Marcus had never learned to respect, the long game. In chess, there's a move called Zugzwang. It's a moment when any move your opponent makes will worsen their position. No matter what they choose, they lose. I wasn't playing chess with Marcus, not yet. But I was learning how to get him there. The first step was gathering the pieces he left unattended. I started with Helmut Fries, our former COO. Marcus had quietly nudged him out 6 months ago after Helmut questioned one of Kronenthal's early proposals. I invited him for coffee at a quiet cafe near the Ulster Lake. It was raining, a soft, polite German drizzle. He looked older than I remembered, exhausted. "You saw it coming, didn't you?" I asked gently. Helmut gave a dry chuckle. "I saw enough." But Marcus was done listening to old advisors. I leaned in. "What if I told you the game isn't over?" He studied me, then his eyebrows lifted. "What are you planning?" I slid a manila folder across the table. Inside was a summary of Lindenthal GmbH's ownership structure, linked clearly to Kronenthal, and a proposal. Not just to buy back shares, but to become part of a new internal advisory board under Bergstrom Holding GmbH. My holding company. Quietly registered months before. Helmut whistled. "You've been busy." "That's the thing about being underestimated," I said. "It leaves you room to work." Over the next 2 weeks I repeated this process. I contacted 2 department heads Marcus had demoted, a lead architect he passed over for promotion, and a group of early investors who had grown wary of Kronenthal's presence. Most of them were skeptical at first. Marcus was still CEO, still the public face. But when I told them what Kronenthal typically did after a buyout, mass layoffs, tech spin-offs, and profit hunting, more than a few of them looked thoughtful. I didn't need everyone. Just enough. Enough to reach blocking power. Enough to make the board hesitate. Enough to give me control. And then came the most satisfying call of all. Annegret Salinger, one of our original angel investors, and an old friend of my late mother. She was known in business circles as the Iron Widow, brilliant, blunt, and absolutely terrifying in negotiations. When I told her what Marcus was planning, she didn't hesitate. "I always liked you more," she said. "You do your homework." Annegret had held on to her original 4.5% voting share for over 2 decades. She transferred it to Bergstrom Holding the next day. With her backing, I crossed the 15% mark, the threshold required to force a vote of no confidence if needed, and Marcus still didn't see it coming. While he was busy planning PR campaigns and buying a new corner office rug, I was rewriting the map beneath his feet. The irony? He had signed every internal policy that allowed it. The company's own rules, his rules, permitted me to acquire voting shares as long as they didn't surpass 25% without board approval. And thanks to a little-known clause he wrote into our expansion bylaws in 2016, spouses and family members were exempt from shareholder disclosure if the holdings were structured through independent financial entities. I wasn't just using his blind spots. I was weaponizing his arrogance. Back at home, we still ate dinner together, though we said little. One night he brought up Julian's wedding again. "Have you thought about what to wear?" he asked. I raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me about fashion?" He shrugged. "It's a formal castle event. Press might be there." I smiled. "I'll wear something unforgettable." He didn't notice the edge in my voice. That week I moved the final piece. I arranged a quiet meeting with Cronenthal Ventures, through a representative Marcus didn't know I had. I told them that our company wasn't interested in being acquired under duress or secrecy, that there were already rumblings among the leadership, that several shareholders had consolidated into a unified bloc. I didn't say who the bloc was, they didn't need to know, but I left them with a single phrase. "If Marcus Bergstrom makes another misstep, you might find yourselves talking to someone else entirely." The room was silent. 2 days later, I received a message. Cronenthal had postponed their interest pending further clarity. That was the moment I knew. It was working. I had pulled the board just far enough to wobble, the investors just far enough to whisper, and Marcus just far enough from reality to believe he was still untouchable. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect time to let it fall. The day after Julian's wedding, I woke before sunrise. The house was still. The roses on the kitchen table, now slightly wilted, gave off a soft perfume as I sipped my coffee. Marcus hadn't come to bed the night before. I imagined him pacing in his home office, replaying the look on my face after his little public retirement announcement. He'd expected shock or maybe quiet acceptance. What he got instead was silence and a USB drive. I opened my laptop and sent a single email. Subject: activation attached was a signed authorization form addressed to our corporate registrar, transferring full voting control of Bergstrom Holding GmbH shares, now just over 19.3%, to me alone, effective immediately. The ball was rolling. Around 9 a.m. Marcus emerged in his blazer and jeans, clearly dressed for his usual Monday sprint at the office. He looked surprised to find me still home. "You're not going in?" he asked. I smiled over the rim of my mug. "No, I think it's your turn to run the books for a change." He frowned. "Linda, listen, I may have misjudged the moment yesterday. I thought it would be symbolic, you know? A celebration of your legacy." "My legacy?" I repeated, setting the cup down. "You announced my departure like a terminated intern, at our son's wedding." He sighed. "I thought we agreed." "No, Marcus. You decided." His jaw tightened. "I need to head in. Big meeting with the advisory group this morning." I nodded. "Then you should take this." I handed him a slim black leather folder. Inside was a printout. An executive summary of Bergstrom Holding GmbH's current shareholder structure, along with its formal declaration of voting rights. He opened it, read silently, then again. His expression changed gradually, curiosity to confusion, then dread. "This isn't possible," he muttered. I leaned back in my chair. "That's the beauty of operating quietly. No one sees the net until it's already around them." He flipped through the pages again. You own this much?" "Directly, only a fraction, but Bergstrom Holding does, and I own Bergstrom Holding." "You've been planning this?" His voice cracked slightly. "For months." He stood there for a moment staring at the table. "You do realize you've set us up for a civil war on the board?" "No, Marcus," I said softly. "You did that when you tried to cut me out. I just made sure I wouldn't be standing outside when the walls collapsed." He left without another word. 2 hours later my phone buzzed. "Incoming call. Helmut Fries." I picked up. "You're at the office?" "Just left the meeting," Helmut said. Marcus looked like someone had poured cold water down his back. "Did he mention the file?" "He didn't have to. Word is already spreading." I closed my laptop. "Good." Later that afternoon I received a request for an emergency board meeting. Apparently Marcus wanted to clarify certain shareholder concerns that had unexpectedly arisen. He didn't realize that 3 of the board members had already spoken with me, and 2 had transferred their proxy votes. At home, the tension became thick enough to slice with a knife. Marcus barely spoke to me. He spent hours in calls behind closed doors. Occasionally I heard shouting. He was trying to regain control, patch the leaks, reassure Cronenthal. Too late. By Thursday, the advisory firm had sent a formal letter postponing further acquisition talks. The board was in flux, they wrote. They needed time to reassess stability. Marcus slammed his fist on the dining table when he read the letter. "You torpedoed the whole deal," he spat. No, Marcus, I replied. You did. You underestimated the one person who built this company with you. He stared at me, breathing hard. You could have talked to me, I said. We could have planned a transition that made sense, but you tried to replace me like outdated software, so now I'm running the update. For the first time, Marcus looked afraid, not of losing money, not even of losing the company, but of losing the illusion that he was the only one in charge. That evening, I poured myself a glass of white wine and went out to the garden. The spring air was sweet with blooming lilacs. I sat quietly beneath the pergola, staring at the twilight sky. Inside, Marcus was calling lawyers. I wasn't worried. He was 5 moves behind, and the endgame was already in motion. Julian showed up 2 nights later, still in his work shirt, sleeves rolled, a loosened tie around his neck. He hadn't called first. He never did when something was weighing on him. I was in the kitchen stirring soup when I heard the door open. His footsteps were quick, tense. "Mom," he called out. "In here." He walked in, set his bag down, and leaned against the counter with crossed arms. "What the hell is going on between you and Dad?" I turned off the stove. "You spoke to him?" "I've barely been able to get a word in," he said. "He's storming around like a lunatic. He says you're staging a coup." I set 2 bowls on the table and motioned for him to sit. "I suppose that's one way to put it." "Is it true?" he asked. "You've been buying back the company?" I looked at him for a long moment. He looked so much like Marcus at that age it nearly hurt, but the eyes, those were mine, sharp, searching. "Yes," I said, "I have." Julian exhaled slowly, then ran a hand through his hair. "Why, you 2 built this thing together." "No," I said quietly. "We started it together, then he tried to finish it without me." I explained everything. Not the revenge narrative Marcus had been painting, but the reality. How I noticed the shell company, how I connected Cronenthal to his secret dealings, how he planned to push me out while profiting off my decades of work. Julian didn't interrupt. He just listened, his jaw tightening with each detail. "Dad told me you were tired," he finally said. "That you wanted to step away." I gave a sad smile. He was hoping I'd go quietly. Maybe he believed it. Maybe he needed to. He looked down at his untouched bowl of soup. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because it was your wedding, Julian. Because I didn't want your memory of that day to be a battlefield between your parents." "You mean like it became anyway?" I flinched. "I'm sorry." He was silent for a while. The clock ticked in the background. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy against the windows. "I always thought you were just the financial side of things," he said finally. "The numbers person, the one who made sure taxes got filed on time." I chuckled softly. "Well, I did that too." He looked up. "But you built this, didn't you?" Quietly. "All this time." I nodded. Julian leaned back in his chair. "So what now?" "I have enough votes to block any hostile sale, enough influence to keep him from signing with Cronenthal, and I'll call a formal vote if he keeps pushing." "And if you win?" he asked. "Then I'll become interim CEO," I said. "Stabilize the company, rebuild from the inside, make it something worth handing down if you want it." He blinked. "Me? I never said anything," I admitted, "because I thought you were happy doing your own thing, but I see how you light up when you talk tech. You have my discipline and your father's spark. That's rare." Julian sat with that for a while, stirring his spoon. "He told me once," he said, "that you were too cautious to lead, that you didn't like risk." "And do you believe him?" He looked up at me. "No, not anymore." We cleared the table in silence, the quiet kind that says more than words. Before he left, he hugged me tightly. "I'm with you," he whispered, "no matter what happens next." As the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Because it wasn't just about the company, it was about my son seeing me, not just as a mother or an accountant or the woman behind the curtain, but as the architect of the life he grew up in, and maybe, as the one who could still lead it forward. The conference room on the top floor of Bergstrom Software was designed to impress. Polished oak table, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Hamburg's skyline, a curated bookshelf that no one had ever read. I hadn't sat at that table in 6 months. But this time I wasn't here as the former CFO or the founder's wife. I was here with voting power, with alliances, and with the calm certainty of someone who had already rehearsed the outcome 100 times. Marcus stood at the head of the table, speaking confidently as the meeting began. "I called this emergency session to clarify recent confusion about our shareholder structure," he said. "There have been rumors, speculation, that control of the company is somehow shifting. I want to assure you all that this leadership remains focused and intact." I folded my hands, said nothing, let him perform. Across from me sat Annegret Salinger, steely-eyed, pen poised above a notepad. Helmut was beside her, stone-faced. Two other board members exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus continued, his voice gaining speed. Cronenthal Ventures remains interested, and I have negotiated a new proposal that benefits all of us. Is that before or after the dilution clause is triggered? I asked, voice calm. Marcus paused. I'm sorry? The clause in our bylaws, I said, lifting a copy of the company charter. Section 4.3, the one that requires board consent for the issuance of new preferred shares during a pending acquisition. A long beat of silence. That clause, he said carefully, is subject to interpretation. No, Helmut spoke up. It's not. It's quite clear. I let that land. Then I opened my folder. Inside were proxy statements, printed and signed, each one a vote, each one shifting momentum. I'd like to formally submit a motion to reconsider board leadership, I said. Marcus stiffened. What are you doing? Bringing transparency, I replied. Exactly what you claimed you wanted. You're trying to take over, he snapped. No, Annegret said coldly. She already has. I stood. As of this morning, Bergstrom Holding GmbH controls 24.6% of total voting rights. Combined with the proxies presented here today, I now represent a majority bloc. A hush fell over the room. Marcus laughed too loudly. You've all been manipulated. She's doing this out of spite. She wants revenge for being phased out. I want accountability, I interrupted. I want long-term vision, and I want the company we built to stop being a bargaining chip in your ego war. One of the board members cleared his throat. We've reviewed the documents. The voting power is legitimate. The proposal to name Linda Bergstrom as interim CEO is valid. Marcus's face drained of color. This isn't how it works. This is exactly how it works, I said. You're the one who set the rules, Marcus. You just never thought they'd apply to you. The vote was quick. 6 in favor, 1 abstention, 1 against Marcus. When the final tally was read, he slumped back into his chair like someone had cut his strings. It was over. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my folder, nodded to the others, and turned to leave. Marcus stood. You won, he muttered. This wasn't about winning, I said, pausing at the door. It was about stopping you before you destroyed what we built. You still think this company was ours? I looked at him evenly. No, not anymore. Now it belongs to the people who actually care about it. Then I walked out into the hallway, the thick glass doors closing behind me with a soft, final click. It wasn't applause I heard. It was the absence of resistance. For years I had worked behind the scenes. Today, I had stepped into the light, not for recognition, not for legacy, but for direction. And for the first time in decades, I was the one steering the ship. The following weeks moved with the slow inevitability of a landslide. At first, Marcus resisted. He filed appeals with the internal legal team, demanded a review of voting rights, even threatened to sue me personally. But each time he acted, he found fewer allies. Fewer doors that still opened, fewer people willing to return his calls. The board stood firm, so did the shareholders. And Cronenthal? They quietly walked away. Their final message was short and to the point. We do not engage in leadership instability. Without the acquisition deal, Marcus had no leverage. Without his title, he had no audience. And without the illusion of power, the myth of Marcus Bergstrom began to crumble. It started small. A longtime investor withdrew support from a parallel project Marcus had started in Berlin. A startup event where he was scheduled to keynote replaced him with a younger CEO. Rumors swirled online. About mismanagement, about internal chaos, about how he lost control of his own company, to his own wife. I heard he tried to spin the story as a family dispute, but truth has a way of surfacing, especially when it's backed by legal filings and voting records. Eventually he stopped showing up at the office. He moved into a rented flat near the harbor, still clinging to a company card he assumed hadn't been canceled. It had. I know, because I was the one who signed the cancellation. While Marcus disappeared from view, I stepped forward, but not as a shadow CEO, not as a woman proving something, as a leader with a plan. I renamed the company Bergstrom Adaptive, a nod to our history but a signal of change. We pivoted towards sustainable logistics solutions, offering new platforms to small European cities struggling with outdated infrastructure. I reinstated voices Marcus had silenced, promoted women he had overlooked, restructured incentives to reward innovation, not just politics. I also started something new, a small initiative born out of nothing more than a lunchtime conversation, a mentorship program for young female founders, particularly those in finance and tech. Within a month we had over 40 applicants. People began to take notice. Media outlets that once fawned over Marcus now asked to interview me. I declined most of them. I didn't need headlines. I needed progress. Julian called every few days. "You're building something different, Mom," he said one evening. "Something real." "I'm just fixing what should have never been broken," I replied. At home, the silence that had once felt like defeat now felt like peace. I converted Marcus's old office into a study lined with plants and old books. I started cooking again, not because I had to, but because I enjoyed feeding myself well. I even reconnected with a former colleague who now taught economics at the University of Hamburg. We had coffee every Thursday talking policy and purpose. 6 weeks after the vote, a package arrived at my doorstep. No note, no sender's name. Inside, Marcus's wedding ring. I stared at it for a long time, then closed the box and placed it in the back of a drawer. I didn't feel triumph, just release. Sometimes, losing something you once valued opens the space for something better, and for me that something was myself. The final divorce papers arrived on what would have been our 31st anniversary. I signed them without ceremony. No tears, no hesitation. Just a quiet afternoon in my sunlit study, a silver pen, and a sense of clarity that had taken me years to earn. Marcus didn't contest anything. He couldn't. The prenup, ironic given how fiercely he'd insisted on it decades earlier, protected me from his debt, preserved my equity, and left him with only what he'd contributed personally, which turned out to be very little. I kept the house, the shares, the name. He kept the stories he told himself, and I suppose the silence of a man who'd burned every bridge trying to protect his pride. But this isn't a story about what Marcus lost, it's about what I found. 6 months after taking the helm at Bergstrom Adaptive, I stood on stage in Copenhagen at a European Innovation Summit. I wasn't there as someone's wife, not as a replacement, not even as a disruptor. I was there as the architect of a turnaround no one had seen coming. My keynote wasn't flashy, no viral catchphrases, just substance. How slow, steady, principled leadership can outlast even the flashiest brands. How integrity still has currency in tech, and how women don't need to scream to be heard, they just need to own the room. Afterward, a line of young entrepreneurs waited to speak to me. They didn't ask how I did it. They asked why I stayed so long in the background, and I told them the truth. Sometimes we wait for permission we never needed. Julian sat in the front row that day. When we got home, he gave me a small framed photo from his wedding, just the two of us, moments before the announcement. My hand on his arm, his head tilted toward mine. I was smiling, but the kind of smile that held years of restraint behind it. He'd written one sentence on the back. "You don't just belong at the table, Mom, you built the house." I kept that frame on my desk, beside the small, potted basil I never remembered to water. As for Marcus, I heard bits and pieces over time. He tried consulting. It didn't stick. He floated around small venture circles, but the shine was gone. The industry moved on quickly, the way it always does. The last I heard, he was living in a quiet neighborhood outside Bremen, alone. Sometimes I wonder if he regrets it. Not the money, not the power, but the fact that the woman who stood beside him all those years had been more than he ever gave her credit for. But even that isn't my burden anymore, because I'm no longer just his wife. I'm Linda Bergstrom, founder, CEO, mentor, and something even rarer in my world, a woman who waited until it was her time and took it without asking. I don't carry bitterness, I carry lessons, and if I could go back and speak to the version of myself who once smiled through dismissals and swallowed her ambition for the sake of someone else's spotlight, I'd say this: you weren't wrong to give your love, your energy, your years. But don't forget, you're allowed to want something of your own. The night I closed the acquisition that saved our company from becoming just another asset on Kronenthal's portfolio, I didn't celebrate with champagne or a press release. I went home, made tea, and opened the envelope I'd kept sealed for months, the one I handed Marcus on our son's wedding day. Inside, I had written, "This isn't revenge, this is the beginning of my side of the story, and now, that story has just begun." Just